Hi, good afternoon or good morning to everybody. Like all of you, I've been working in a bit of a lonely exploration for the last 2 or 3 years on this project, and I'm a little desperate for feedback at this point and conversation. I took this project to Sharp in 2021 for a book historian's point of view, and then to NAVSA for a British 19th century point of view, and now look forward to your feedback today, specifically about 19th century colonialism and upending the colonizer's gaze. The focus of my research in this brief talk is the Literary Annual, a wildly popular serialized literary form published in London beginning in 1823. All of these include poetry, fiction, nonfiction, engravings of famous and original artwork in both woodcut and steel plate engravings. Its luxury was marked by glazed paper, silk or leather boards with gilt-edged paper, and 10 to 12 steel plate engravings, along with 350 pages of literary texts. Yearly publication in November with a form similar to the almanacs at first, soon became an export of literary and artistic imagination and genius to the British colonies as a form of British exceptionalism. Contents included up to 50 or 60 texts of popular and best-selling poetry and fiction, nonfiction, accounts about the doings of the empire, as well as the quotidian bucolic happenings of British citizens. As you can see, the production of content in these British publications afforded a great many variant voices that are often not studied today. In addition, as I worked on my previous book about the history of literary annuals in England, I started noticing just how many of the engravings, short stories, and poems were not inclusive of Indian authors, but they were a lot about India. I also noticed how many tales translated from Hindi and other languages were contained in the literary annual pages. Then how few of the colonial subjects' voices appeared, almost none, among all of those 350 pages with each volume. There were more than 3,000 London published literary annuals, so there was lots of opportunity to invite different voices. The engravings, though, became more and more about India and China as the decades progressed and the popularity increased of these British published publications. Readers were fascinated by these exotic lands and believed in the stereotypes that entertained them. In an article titled "On the Progress and Present State of the Native Press in India," published in the Gazette Friend of India in October 1825, the author writes that, quote, "The rise of the empire of the press constitutes a new, if not the most important era in the history of man. To it we owe the discovery of the means by which the great bulk of society may be enlightened without forsaking the ordinary occupations of life." End quote. To counter this decidedly Western point of view, scholar Daniel White notes in his book From Little London to Little Bengal that, quote, "The ignorance of India and England was a repeated theme in Calcutta writing," end quote. This is certainly true of the material that we're investigating today. Publishers and editors soon came to learn that readers in England wanted the beauty of the engravings as much as they desired to read the literary contents about military conquests, foreign royalty, epic romance, and Gothic tales in each volume's duodecimo or octavo pages. The annuals were also filled with tales of faraway lands and colonial holdings, and the engravings here, all from the most popular annuals, focus on India and rendered in the highest quality using steel plate engravings with such fine detail that often the annuals were sold with a magnifying glass. Eventually, the size of the entire volume was increased to allow for study by these middle-class readers up close, and they offered a voyeuristic, colonialist gaze upon that colonized other. The export of this literary annual form and the exoticizing of the Indian colonial subjects was landed right at the doorstep of the first Calcutta published literary annual, though its editor, David Lester Richardson, would have certainly been familiar with both the luxurious materiality of the London literary annuals as well as their well-worn visual and literary contents. The Bengal Annual, published 1830 to 1837, was the only literary annual published in India. This title, modeled after the London annuals, extended the boundaries of home to Britain's colonial empire by including both British and just a few Indian authors. The material aspects of this literary annual certainly don't match the pleasing luxury of the boards, the gilt edges, the India paper, the clear type, and steel plate engravings of the London published literary annuals, though. Early in the literary annual craze, Rudolf Ackermann was already engaging in a colonial voyeurism through both the engravings and literature offered in this originating literary annual title, The Forget-Me-Not, which was the very first literary annual first published in 1823. On the left is an engraving from The Forget-Me-Not for 1825 based on Sakuntala, a character from Hindu mythology who marries a warrior and then spends a long amount of time waiting for his return. This engraving accompanies a poem that revises the myth and is about an empress who dies of a broken heart. The first 20 lines are dedicated to her beauty, but the editor, Frederick Scherbel, includes a note that this particular version of the Sakuntala myth is translated from the German, with her as a representation of the Queen of Prussia. On the right is the fruit seller from the Oriental Annual for 1835. Separated by a 10-year publication span, the details on these engravings provide the downward gaze of both women, one ornately adorned, staying true to the representation of the exotic other, and the woman on the right seemingly partially nude, though the shadows inhibit the full view of her breast and create a two-tone skin color that offers ambiguity between the skin and the clothing that would assuredly titillate the reader. The single exposed breast wasn't a new visual aesthetic for the 19th century reader, but it was usually not sexualized and instead reserved for a maternal image. Here, both women are eroticized and exoticized through their clothing and their bodies, both in an attempt to erase the Orientalism in the tale and reify this idea of the erotic other captured by a woman selling fruit on the street. The beautiful and the sublime, both hallmarks of the British Romantic period, both pleasing and terrifying, also both hallmarks of the British Romantic period, because you could never have seen an engraving of a white British woman in either of type of this repose. The fruit seller's exposed breast signals neither sublimity nor maternal beauty, and instead this moment is quiet, but one that's public and commodified and a representation of work, selling fruit. She's part of a spectacle and a voyeuristic view of everyday life in India. While Sakuntala, on the other hand, doesn't have an exposed breast, the image coupled with the editor's note about translation turns this myth into an analogy for the Queen of Prussia. So the Hindu or the exotic is removed by the linguistic note, but the visual aesthetics signal an exotic woman who has no other role than to be beautiful and then die, unlike the myth itself. And note that this is translated from the German, which isn't unusual considering that both publisher Ackerman and editor Scherbel were German immigrants and often included German literary translations in the most popular and long-running annual, The Forget-Me-Not. Graduate students did something for another slide that's not shown today. The opening essay of the 1830 Bengal Annual, The Literati of India, by an anonymous author, denigrates Indian authors by declaring that they don't represent the greatness of England's exported literary tradition. And Richardson in the preface declares that he had to use, quote, local talent to render these woodcut engravings, which are far from the exotic Orientalist view heralded in the London annuals. The woodcut engravings represent a reductive landscape almost completely devoid of human subjects in comparison to the images on the previous slide. The British Romantic period represents the first time that authors owned their own copyrights and moved away from the patronage system, and therefore were free to critique anyone around them and establish experimental literary forms. Since there was no international copyright, others were also free to pirate these literary renderings. Once we get to the engravings of the Bengal Annual, the complete lack of the sublime and beauty is stark. No landscape images, no representations of the sublime, no overt articulation of the romantic version of beauty. And with Richardson's disavowal of the quality of the engravings themselves and use of woodcut methods for the engravings, this makes me wonder about the intended readership for this annual, the Anglo-Indian inhabitants or the Indian inhabitants. I turn to Priya Joshi's imagery about this transactional relationship between the British Empire and its Indian colonial subjects. She writes, quote, I picture the British Empire in India with the image of two sides facing each other, with their arms outstretched, each side taking, snatching, pilfering, plundering what and when it could, but also giving, exchanging, and unevenly borrowing fitfully and sporadically, but persistently from the other. Transaction between two unequal and unequally motivated sides in an encounter that, despite an unevenness, was still characterized by exchange of some sort. End quote. The succeeding volumes of the Bengal Annual, according to reviews, don't have as great a variety of authors as the first volume, but according to the London Annuals, this is a mainstay of this genre. In fact, Richardson himself begins to supply multiple poems and writings in the later volumes, which arguably turns this multi-author visual and literary form into a single author volume of poetry and prose. Richardson's declarations, the use of woodcut engravings, and the opening essay all create this hybridity, not for the colonial subjects, though, instead for Richardson himself and the Anglo authors included in this volume. They are writing out of bounds but still within the empire. With the removal of complexity from the imagery, these bucolic engravings actually end up removing that voyeuristic reader. Did Calcutta engravers unintentionally create a hybrid engraving style that marries Calcutta with London artistic traditions, which eradicates the sublime, which terrifies an individual into a state of clarity or self-preservation? Does this undermine the British Empire's colonizing project in India in this particular media form? The London-based engravings are alternately terrifying and pleasing, sublime and beautiful, but that same aesthetic doesn't adhere with these engravings. The answer, I think, requires a close look at the representation of beauty and the sublime in the accompanying literary text in the Bengal Annual, but I think that's a presentation for another day. I'm less interested in what happened with the British editor, who was also a newspaper owner, and instead, I'm more interested in the next step in this project to pick up where I've left off to assess the representation of beauty and the sublime in this 1830 volume in order to assess the evolution of these concepts according to the representation of both these quote local amateur engravers and the Indian authors. Priya Joshi provides this idea of the company engraving, which married London and Indian aesthetics, but not in subservience or mimicry to the London artistry. There's so much more work to do, the most important of which is to hear from South Asian book history scholars themselves about the colonial and transactional consumption of materials like the Bengal Annual. Gaining access to those studies, though, is problematic and difficult. I'm hoping as a side project that I can help republish some of these important monographs at university presses to afford bigger circulation of this excellent scholarship. And I'm hoping that some of you are in the audience today and can provide even more information and help in revising this whole presentation towards something that can be advanced. I look forward to your comments, which will be recorded or noted down and returned back to me, and really appreciate anything or any help that anybody can provide. Thank you.